Hey, so for tonight, I planned to talk about how we navigate student complaints and expectations, which, if you're a teacher in training, it's maybe not exciting to look forward to a time when students are going to be coming to you with complaints. But that is part of our role as yoga teachers is to not only teach a great class of, flowing through yoga postures and breath work and relaxation, but also to manage students' complaints and to manage their expectations and to manage our class culture. And in order to do that, it's really useful to start to think in advance of what kinds of things might come up in class that students might be coming to you with and how you're going to manage those things. Sometimes those are things that are under your control. Sometimes those are things that are not under your control. But doing some preparation or rehearsal in advance can really help you navigate those situations should they arise. Um, because the thing is, when you're teaching yoga to humans, and humans have stuff coming up in their lives. They can have emotions arising in their yoga class, and sometimes that can come out in um, having experiences that they want to talk to you about that they don't like or didn't expect, or maybe we're looking for something different in their yoga class. So that's what we're going to talk about today. It's really nice when you don't get complaints. And you usually don't, right? Usually, what happens if a student is unhappy with a class is they just don't come back. And so you never know what made them leave. Was the room too cold? Did they not like the music? Or did they not like that style of class? Or did something happen in class that they weren't comfortable with? Often you never know because students just don't return. And um, and that goes with positive feedback as well. Often we don't get positive feedback. We just get thank you, or people looking really dreamy as they wander out of class at the end after relaxation. Um, One of the ways, I'm not suggesting that you go out looking for student complaints, but one of the ways that we can improve our classes is to request feedback and to find out what are people coming to class for? What are they liking about class? What are things that they would like more of or less of? How can we meet their needs better? And that's usually when we can start to get a little bit more feedback. It's much less common that a student speaks up in class or after class about something that they just don't like and come to you with, I have a complaint to make. That's less common, but it does happen. And so, and I haven't handled those kinds of situations well in my own teaching career, especially when I was getting started. It came as a real shock to me that I'd poured my heart and soul into a class and someone complained afterwards. And that's why I think it's good for us to maybe think about being prepared for those potential moments. Um, and to have some strategies to draw on, and again, maybe do a little bit of mental rehearsal, or doing some reading or some research into how we might handle things like student complaints or students feeling that their expectations haven't been met. So that's what we'll talk about today. We'll talk a little bit about like what are students' expectations coming to class, how we can meet those expectations, and how we can handle any complaints and maybe prevent complaints arising in the first place, so that we can create a really positive learning environment for everyone. And that includes you as a teacher, because you want to have positive experiences when you're teaching yoga. So the first thing is to kind of think about what are students' expectations when they come to class. And one of the ways that we manage their expectations is by having really open communication and being transparent about what our classes are going to be and how we might work together to meet everyone's goals and what they expect from your class. And that can happen in like when people make an initial phone call or text or email about your class to ask them what they're looking for in a yoga class. Um, or when they're registering, when you're doing your initial intake, at the opening of the class, or in post-class check-ins, to talk about what are you looking for from your yoga class, what are your aims, what kinds of yoga have you done in the past, so that you can understand where each student is coming from and why they're in your class, right? Because we want to know. We want to know, are they coming for fitness? Are they coming to have a spiritual experience? Do they think yoga is, lying on the floor and listening to crystal bowls being played, or do they think yoga is doing really challenging movements all in a really dynamic flow? So getting to know where students come from and what they're coming to your class for, that can be really useful in being able to openly discuss people's expectations for class. These days, many of your students are going to be fairly well educated about what kind of yoga class they're going to. That we've got enough yoga now in popular culture that people have a better understanding of what yoga is, but it can arise that people have been to another yoga class and think that all yoga classes are the same. And so sometimes what can arise is that students have been doing a gentle class or a hatha yoga class or a dhru class or a kundalini class, and don't realize when they sign up for your dynamic vinyasa flow class that they've signed up to have a really different experience. And so it can be useful to open your class or have really clear class descriptions about what people can expect in class. And so here we're looking at, like, okay, I've got 20 students here coming with their own needs and their own goals and their own expectations. And some are looking for fitness, and some are looking for stress management, and some are looking for that spiritual journey. And you can try to cater to all those diverse needs whenever possible. But there can be issues when we try to be everything to everyone. So to meet people's expectations, we start by being clear about what our class is. So, like, through the class title and description, is this a beginner's class, an all levels class, an advanced class? Is this a class focusing on flow, or is it a really technical class? Or is this a class all about relaxation? Is it a slow flow? Is it dynamic? So being able to really clearly outline what's going to happen in your yoga class can help people understand what kind of experience they're going to have, and allows people to make an informed choice before they even arrive at class, so that they're choosing the class that best meets their expectations and their preferences for yoga, right? So being able to explain to people that, there's lots of yoga out there and this is one kind of yoga, that can really help to manage people's expectations about what's coming to class, what's going to happen in class. I remember in Canberra, I got a call from a guy. I'm not sure why he called me, because he'd never been to any of my classes, but he called and he was complaining to me that he'd gotten this class pass that they had going on in Canberra, where you bought like a 10 class pass and all these different studios and teachers had signed up for it. And so you could drop in on a bunch of different classes and try things out. So we'd gone to all these different places, tried all these different classes. And then he called me up and he was complaining to me that all the classes were different. And he was really upset by that. And I was like, I'm not in charge of those people, eh? And like, yeah, all classes are different. Even if you take a particular style of yoga, like vinyasa flow, every teacher has a different take on what is vinyasa flow. Every class is going to be subtly different. The sequence might be different, the pace might be different, the poses might be different, because of the teacher and the way that the teacher is creating the class and the way that the teacher is tailoring the class to their usual student base. So yeah, every class is going to be a little bit different. And he was really upset by that. He didn't like it. He wanted yoga to be kind of uniform, and so that he could have the same experience no matter where he went. And I thought it was a really interesting expectation to have of yoga. And so what do I recommend to this student who has this complaint? Find one teacher and stick with them, right? Rather than, you've tried out a bunch of classes, you didn't like that they were all different, but maybe you liked one of those classes more than another. Maybe it really met your needs, met your expectations. So pick one teacher or one studio and stick with it. Choose a yoga style that is more consistent. Vinyasa flow is quite an inconsistent style of yoga because it's an amalgamation of some different influences in yoga. There's a lot of room for creativity, and that means that there's a lot of room for difference. If you want something that's going to be a lot more consistent, you might be looking at a style of yoga like Iyengar yoga, which tends to be a lot more consistent, right? Or one of the older lineages, Shivananda yoga or Satyananda yoga, where there might be a lot more routine and consistency if that's what someone's preference is for their yoga practices, knowing in advance, what am I going to experience when I get there? And Vinyasa flow kind of isn't so much like that. Ashtanga primary series, that's a very consistent style, so you know what you're going to get when you arrive at class. So you might recommend finding a teacher, a studio, or a style that has more routine, has more consistency, if that's what your preference is. That's the thing about managing expectations, is to do some educating and help your students understand what's going to happen in your class and what they can expect in advance of class, if possible, so that they can drop into the experience and have an experience rather than spending their time thinking, what's coming next? Is this the thing I know, or is this going to be something I don't know? And have their mind racing the whole time. Which for new students happens kind of anyway. A student who, does anyone remember their first yoga class? I definitely remember my first. I didn't know what was happening. Sun salutations. I was like, and this, and that, and this, and then this. Oh, we do it again. So that and this, and it was all very exciting and very confusing. And it took a few classes for me to go, okay, so this is what a yoga class is. We start here, then we do this, then we do that, then we're lying down. And that's when I was really able to kind of drop into the experience. For people like me with a lot of anxiety, sometimes how we manage our anxiety is by figuring out what we can expect and then getting what we expect. And when we don't get what we expect, emotions can arise. And that's where some student complaints can come from, was that I had this expectation and I was going to be able to relax into that, and then it didn't happen, so I wasn't relaxed, and now I'm a bit upset, right? And so knowing that, when you develop your classes, take some time to think about how much routine will be in your classes and how much variety, right? How much will there be the known and how much will there be the unknown? And in a style like Vinyasa flow, what are some of the knowns? What are some of the things that are going to be routine in a class? Hopefully you've left some time for relaxation at the end. Hopefully your opening can have some routine. This is where you're making choices. Will students lie down at the start of class? Will they begin in child's pose? Will they begin seated with some breath work? That's a place where you can kind of give people a little more routine so that they can drop in, like, this is how I start a yoga class. Not only is that soothing to the mind, like, okay, this is how I start a yoga class, but it starts to work on your nervous system. If you have a consistent gateway into class, then your nervous system gets to know, we're doing yoga now. I can relax. And that helps people drop in, right? So you might think about having some consistency in how you open a class. I mean, this is your canvas. You can paint whatever picture you like, right? But I do recommend having a balance between routine and variety, to not change everything every time, so that students can have some kind of repetition of experience. That's good, again, for the mind, for the nervous system. It's also good for students to be able to get to know a pose so that they can improve. If they're never doing consistent poses or pose flows, they never get to go, I've done this before and I remember I needed to do this to make that more comfortable, or I liked this part because it was more challenging. If they never get to repeat experiences, they don't get to explore their growth, right? So I do recommend thinking about having a balance of routine and variety. And at least if you want to really play with variety a lot in your classes, I recommend at least having some kind of landing places where people can go, I'm here now in the class, right? So how you're gonna, the position you're gonna open your class with. And again, that might be lying down, child's pose, seated, whatever. And then there's gonna be some kind of warm up. There's gonna be some kind of sun salutations, right? That flow from your opening posture through whatever warm-ups you do in sun salutations, even if they're a little bit different or have some differences. One day you do hands and knees warm up, another day you do them seated or you do them standing, right? But it's still the same 6 movements of the spine. That's enough routine for students to know, yeah, this is how I enter a class, right? Sitting down at the halfway point is a good landmark. So we do our warm-ups, sun salutations, standing poses, balancing poses. We sit down in Dandasana at about the halfway place. And that's where students can go, okay, now I get it. We've done the standing stuff. Now we're sitting. We're going to do seated, strengthening, back bending. And then, of course, there's the landmark of Shavasana, right? I did that yoga class. Now I get to lie down, right? And all the stuff that happens in between those places can have tons of variety and innovation. But when those landing places stay the same, that can be really soothing and can give students a sense of familiarity and knowing, which can contribute to someone's ability to drop into a class and relax. So that's something to think about. So when a student has a complaint that a class wasn't what they expected, or it wasn't like another class they've gone to, it can be useful to take some time to think about how you're going to address that. And I just want to point out that sometimes it's something that we can address, and sometimes it's something that we can't or won't address, right? One of the things I try to remember when I'm handling a student complaint is I want to support this student as much as I can. I want to meet their needs and their expectations as much as I can. But I have to do that with an understanding that I'm teaching for a whole. I'm teaching a whole class, which this student is an important part of. But I have to meet the needs and expectations of a whole class. So how much am I willing to do to cater to one student's needs? And I have to think about whether meeting those needs is going to compromise the rest of the class. So sometimes when we're handling student complaints, it's a little bit about negotiating between individual needs and collective needs. And some things I'm willing to make changes on, and some things I'm not willing to make changes on. And so that's something for you to kind of think about and get to know about how much you're willing to adjust or adapt your classes or your teaching style or the poses or the music or the temperature of the room or the lights, how much you're willing to adapt those for individual needs versus meeting group needs. And that's something I think is useful to kind of think about. One of the reasons it's useful to think about is so that you can be prepared for any kind of student complaint that might come your way. The other reason I think it's useful is because clarity about who you are as a teacher and what kind of class you want to teach is useful for the entirety of your teaching practice. And it's something that's not fixed. That's something that's fluid and is going to change as you grow and learn and evolve and try different things in your classes. Um, but well, I'll speak for myself. When I first started teaching, I could get easily distracted by the next shiny thing that came around. And my classes would change a lot based on what I was learning and what I was excited about, um, which makes for very dynamic classes, uh, but wasn't necessarily meeting the needs of all of my students. And it took me a long while for me to figure out, with all this experimenting, who I was as a teacher and what kind of spaces I liked to hold and I had the skills to hold, and what kinds of classes I was best suited to teaching and that I enjoyed teaching. And again, that took a lot of experimenting. Um, but some of the things I tried were absolutely not in my skill set, and I did not enjoy teaching. And that came across to my students. I had a lot more um, attrition in my classes. I handled more student complaints when I was trying things that weren't consistent with who I was as a teacher and what kind of classes I was best trained and experienced to teach. And again, it took time for me to get that kind of clarity. But once I had that clarity, my classes really flowed. And I drew together groups of students that I really enjoyed teaching and that really enjoyed my particular classes. Um, so that's something to think about, is you don't have to create a brand for your classes and stick rigidly to that brand. You can experiment, but taking some time to develop some clarity about who you are as a teacher and what kind of classes you want to teach and what kind of people you want to teach to, that can smooth the waters of the entirety of your teaching practice. Does that make sense? So, how do you handle student complaints? What are some strategies that humans use when they're having conflict with another human? Anyone heard of active listening? So, listening actively, being empathetic, making sure that how you're communicating with a student lets them know that they've been heard, that they've been understood. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with them or make the changes that they might want made, but just letting someone know that their voice has value and that they've been heard and that you understand where they're coming from, that can often diffuse tense situations. And if you don't have a lot of experience with that kind of conversation, this is something to practice. Maybe in your everyday life, it's a great skill to have for every facet of your life, but being able to hold space when things are uncomfortable and stay there with someone and be able to listen and say, I understand. Um, when we're teaching yoga, I find that we're giving so much of ourselves personally that if someone has a complaint, it feels like a personal attack. That who you are, your essence, is the thing that people are complaining about. So it's good to remember that often student complaints arise from their own discomfort or likes or preferences or expectations that doesn't so much have to do with you or your teaching. And that can help diffuse your own emotions around a student complaint so that you don't start to feel attacked and you don't start to feel defensive. So being able to just hold space and let someone know that they feel understood, and you don't have to have immediate solutions. So if a student comes to you and says, I didn't like this, and it made me feel this way, being able to listen, I understand you didn't like this and it made you feel this way, and I'm going to take some time to think about some solutions, right? So that you don't have to immediately respond. Sometimes conflicts can be um, escalated when we feel like we have to immediately respond and either fix the problem or defend ourselves. And you can just take time. You say, I understand, I hear where you're coming from. I'm going to take some time to think about some solutions. Thanks for bringing this to me. And then you can go away, and outside of that more intense environment, you can take some time to reflect and think about that issue and what you're willing or able to do to address that issue, right? So don't feel like you have to address it straight on. And take on any feedback you're getting constructively, right? Because you often won't get feedback, um, the feedback you get are opportunities for improvement. It's really nice to hear from your students. Oh, I loved that class. I love the way you teach. You're so wonderful. That's all really nice. And but it doesn't really help you grow as a teacher. So when people give you constructive feedback, those are your chances to look at how you might grow as a teacher and to look at what kinds of experiences your students are having. You're putting all of this out there into the world. How's the world responding? Um, and if people do have constructive feedback for you, don't hesitate to ask for details, right? Don't hesitate to ask for examples so that you can best understand where they're coming from, right? Um, for example, I had a student once with a complaint that she didn't like. Complaint was that it started out that she didn't like that I moved around the room, which I do a lot when I'm teaching face to face. I teach from the front mat, then I move to the side. Sometimes I come to the back. And she really didn't like that. And in digging into that feedback that she gave me, it turns out that what she didn't like was that she wanted to be at the back of the class so like no one could see her and look at her and judge her yoga practice. And when I would move around the room, she would go from being at the back of the class to suddenly being at the front of the class and felt a spotlight on her, and it made her feel really uncomfortable. Um, and so it was a lot less about me as a person or me as a teacher, and a lot more about how she could feel comfortable in a yoga space. And so then that's something that we kind of worked on together. So it wasn't really about me and my teaching style. It was about where she needed to hold space for herself, for her practice. It can really break your heart when you think you've taught a great class and you've poured your heart into it and you've watched your students in Shavasana and you love them so much. And then someone comes up and says, I didn't like that song you played that one time. You're like, what? It's not even about me. It can, and so knowing that often it's not actually about you and that students are just trying to make a comfortable space for themselves in your class for the most part, right? That's what they're doing. And the music I play has nothing to do with me as a teacher. I'm happy to change that. In fact, that's the reason I don't use music in my classes, is that that was the number one thing that students would have complaints about, was music. I really liked the music you played last time. Why didn't you play it this time? Or I really liked this one song and didn't like this other song. None of that has to do with the experience I want students to have in yoga. So I just eliminated music. Plus, I'll admit, I'm prone to technical problems with music. Something I really admire our group fitness instructor friends for being experts in pairing music and yoga class, and it was never my forte. So that was one of the things that my clarity about myself as a teacher was like, I don't do the best with music, and I really don't like music complaints, so I'm getting rid of it. And I prefer that. Students who really like music in their class come to my class, and if they don't like to practice yoga without music, then they find another class. And that's one of the things about dealing with student complaints, is knowing where you're going to adapt and where you're not going to adapt, right? Sometimes you can find solutions for a student and sometimes you can't. So in identifying a problem, you can work with that student to find a solution. So with the student who didn't like that I moved around the class, she didn't like being at the front when we faced the back. We were able to find a spot in the room that really suited her and gave her a safe space to develop her practice. And I would put a mat out to hold that space for her so that she always had that consistent spot to be in where she was comfortable. And over time, she got a lot more comfortable being in a yoga space and moving in a room with other people, and it wasn't a concern. But the solution we came up with together was like, she needs that spot, and that's where she's going to feel comfortable. And I was willing to give her that. You'll find that a lot with your students, is that they have a spot in the room where they feel most comfortable. How does a yoga space usually fill up? The back, then the sides. The last spots to take are these ones right here in front of you. Yeah. And so sometimes students, and you'll find this about your students, that they have a strategy of when they arrive at class so that they can get a spot that's comfortable for them. And I'm okay with that. I want to provide a safe transformational space for my students. So I'm not a teacher that forces people to juggle where they go in class. I want students to be comfortable. And where they go in a room, if that's important to them, then that can be important to me too. So a lot of times you'll teach a class with like no one in front of you and everyone at the back and sides, and that's okay. That gives you more room to play front and center, right? This is right when I first moved to Australia. I was teaching at a Fernwood in Brisbane, and the student I could picture her so clearly. This is more than 20 years ago. She would come in and she would go right in front of me, and she would whip out her mat in what really felt like a confronting way, like sort of aggressively rolling out her mat. And she was so close to me. It was a really big class, so it was a pretty full room. And she was so close to me, and it felt really confronting, and it really had me questioning myself and like, why does she hate me? Why does she keep coming back to my class? Like, it really put me off my game. And I would have to not look at her. Like Catherine said, I would have to be like, I can't, the intensity of this person so close to me every class. And over time, I came to realize she just really liked the class. She wanted to be front and center because she was keen. And it wasn't, there was no aggression in it. It wasn't competitive. It wasn't that she didn't like, she was just really keen to be there. And if she ever had to miss class, she was really sad and she'd be so excited when she came back. And it was a really good lesson for me in making assumptions about people based on those kinds of actions. And again, having open dialogue with students and appreciating students' uniqueness can be really helpful in those kind of situations where you can have someone totally wrong. There'll be times when you have a student who's in your class and they're making faces, and like in my brain, I'll be like, do they hate what I just said? Like, why are they making that face? Oh, they hate my class. I'm a terrible yoga teacher. I've got to give it all up. I can really catastrophize whilst teaching yoga. And it turns out like their face has nothing to do with me. That's just their face. That's the face they use when they're doing yoga. And so learning to not personalize when someone else is having an experience in your class, this is a really good skill to develop. Even if it is about you, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to change your personality? Are you going to change your teaching style? Like, what are you willing to do to make someone happy in your class? And the answer should not be adjust anything about who you are as a person, right? We do that enough in life, adjusting and adapting who we are to meet other people's expectations or preferences or who they think you are. We don't need to do that in yoga class. Yoga class is a place where we can be ourselves and share our best. And if someone's looking for a different teacher with a different personality or a different style, you can refer them on, right? Because sometimes you can feel that kind of pressure, which may or may not be true, that students want you to be something different than you are. And that's just too hard. And it's not yoga to change yourself for other people's expectations. I remember a good friend of my family who became a yoga teacher. She was teaching in Toronto and she took over a class for another teacher. And this can be a challenge when students have gotten really used to a teacher and their personality and their teaching style. And to take over, there can sometimes be a period of adjustment. And she was really struggling with how students were responding to her teaching style. She taught a different form of yoga, and management never explained that this is a different kind of yoga. So students were just kind of always leaving class upset. That wasn't power yoga. And she's like, it's not power yoga. Like, that's not what I teach. But what it took was like just people getting to know her. And I feel like if there'd been more transparency about we're changing teachers and this is going to be a change of yoga style, there might have been a lot less discomfort with that transition. But because there wasn't that transparency, she had to go through several weeks of like students leaving class, going and getting on the treadmill outside the room, like, I didn't get to move enough in that class. It wasn't power yoga. And she was really like, do I have to change myself and my teaching style for these students? I don't think those issues would have been so big if there'd been a lot more transparency about that change. So when I'm taking over someone else's class, I like to be really clear. Hi, I'm Heather. I'm not Bill. Sorry about that. I know you love Bill, but here I am. And we're going to be doing things a little bit differently than you might have done with Bill. So let me explain what that's going to look like and give people an introduction to what's going to be different. I'm going to be different, and some of these things in your class are going to be different. And I hope we have a great time doing yoga together, right? In that way, you're giving people an opportunity to adjust their expectations. And that's where so many of your student complaints are going to come from, is feeling like I had this expectation and I didn't get it. So let them know up front that they need to change their expectations because this is going to be different. Like, we think about yoga all the time. We think about our students all the time. They don't think about us so much. And that's something when you can start to feel really self-conscious or worried about your performance as a teacher, it's good to remember that it's not about you, it's about them. And for the most part, they're going to come in and do their class and feel sleepy and wander out and not give you feedback. And it's not a reflection of you as a teacher. It's a reflection of they've received the class they were looking for, and they've maybe been lying in Shavasana thinking, oh, Catherine's the best yoga teacher. I feel so relaxed. But they don't say it to you. And I'd recommend not needing that, because you might not get it. Some class cultures or studio cultures, people always say something at the end of class. But for the most part, yeah, you're going to get nothing. And that's, so prepare yourself for that. Right. And as you said, back yourself. And sometimes you'll think you've taught the worst class in the world. And that's when a student will come up to you and say, it's the best yoga class I've ever been to. And somehow that was a class that met people where they were at. Right. So the thing, and this is one of the things that I think is useful, both in developing your teaching practice and also in overcoming nerves, is to remember that it's not about you, that teaching yoga is not a performance, and it's not about you. You're there to be a guide for students to have their experience, and it's your experience is kind of less important in that moment. You want to be able to hold a safe space for yourself. You want to be able to hold a space where you're empowered and where you can share your voice. But ultimately, the class is about them. It's not about you. And if you make a mistake, almost no one dies from that. If you mix up your left and right, almost no one's going to die. So being able to just get over that and move on, right? And continue to focus the class on your students. I think that that can really help you manage nerves. It can help you manage performance anxiety. It can help you handle any inevitable mistakes that you make. You know, every once in a while, you'll forget to teach sun salutations or something, like it happens. And know that your students are going to live through that experience and they might actually really enjoy that experience, and that's okay, right? Being thirsty for feedback can sometimes put students off, but if you're really wondering what kind of experience students are having in your class, you can ask them. You can ask for feedback. You know, if anyone has any feedback, I'm a new teacher, I'm developing my teaching practice. I'd love to get feedback after class if you have a moment. You can do a survey monkey or something and get people to give some feedback anonymously that way. Because often you won't know what kind of experience students are having. You won't know what it is they love about your class. So you kind of do have to ask. The last thing I'll mention, I'll make you some notes about some other things I was going to talk about. But the last thing I'll mention is, what if a student complaint or feedback is something you can't control? What do you do? They're like, I don't like the noisy gym outside the room, or I don't like the temperature when you have no temperature control, or the class before this always leaves late and I don't like that. And these are things that you can't control. So how might you address that with your students? Happens less often in yoga, but it does happen where you have a student who doesn't understand kind of the general class culture, that we just don't shout out what we're thinking in the middle of class, right? And so figuring out how you're going to handle something like that, like, I hear you. Let's talk about this after class. For now, let's drop back into the breath, right? Something, that in your words, that lets people know I'm hearing you. I want to talk about this, but not right now because we're in the middle of yoga class, right? Um, and then when it's something that's out of your control, you might talk to your students about how, like, this is something we can't control, and I get that it's bothering you. Wish I could change it, but I can't. So this is an opportunity for us to practice yoga. When you're in relaxation and people are clanging weights in the room outside, that can be an opportunity to practice pratyahara, management of your senses, to not let that thing that you can't control steal from your yoga practice, to not have to follow that distraction into thinking about how annoying it is and how much it bugs you, and then letting your mind take a tumble in that direction. So this is a chance for us to practice yoga. It bugs me too when I hear that noise. I have to keep bringing my mind back here. So this is a chance for us to learn how to stay even when there's distractions. So you can bring things back to yoga philosophy in a genuine way, and give people some strategies to manage their preferences and expectations and the distractions that might arise. And that's what you can do when there's complaints about things you can't control, right? Which, especially if you teach in the gym, usually those complaints are going to be about lights that you don't have control of, noise you don't have control of, or people wandering into the room to get a piece of equipment and wandering out again. And that's often outside of your control as well. So I hope that's useful. Thank you to those of you who are here. I really appreciate you and your voices. Hello to those of you listening to the recording. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks so much.